Hi, I'm Dr. Scotty Horey, faculty member of the Music School of Delaware and internationally active endorsing artist and clinician with Sabian cymbals, Vic Firth sticks, Mapex drums, and majestic percussion. Welcome back to Tools for the Journey. Of course, this is my lecture series, and we're going to start with episode number 2, which is entitled, What is Philosophy? Many of today's issues are large-scale issues, and they have prompted us to re-examine some of our most deeply rooted and far-reaching beliefs and truths. How we think about the world and what we may feel we know are the right things to do. The issues today are within just about every major discipline in human history: politics, social issues, religion and spirituality, health and wellness, environmentalism, business and economics, technology, and things like trust in institutions. The awareness of how we can have different philosophical views on these topics is of utmost importance. If we're indeed to keep up with the fast pace of these growing fields and correctly address just how serious they will impact our lives, we need to re-examine the tools we use to think about them and analyze them. So technology usually is the could of human civilization, for example, and philosophy asks us the should. And this is where education comes in. And again, I will state my goal with this whole lecture series is not to detail my personal opinions or delve into any one area of the disciplines, but rather to offer a review of the full discipline, in this case philosophy, and of the tools that cultures have used all throughout human history to examine these issues. So I want to give you an introduction to these fields. Today is about philosophy. I want to incite curiosity in these fields. The field we'll discuss today, like I said, is philosophy and its application and utility to helping us be better equipped to address some of today's issues, as well as explore meaning, which of course we rely on philosophy and religion and spirituality in some cases to do so, and science and tech cannot do these things. They cannot define meaning for us. So we all make philosophical assertions in our life, either verbally or to ourselves or with our communities. And we do that whether you realize it or not. Everybody does it. Sometimes they're conscious, sometimes they're unconscious. And this is a simple fact of psychology, and it's also a neurophysiological fact in the sense that the brain has a hierarchy of things like meaning and motivations. So there's some biological correlates to meaning as well. So we all are hardwired to make philosophical assertions. Now, whether we call them philosophical assertions or they sound academic is irrelevant. We all do it in different ways, especially in a social context. So, for example, how do we decide what is right and what is wrong? How do we decide what has value and what has no value, or what has meaning, or what has more meaning than other things? And one point that I want to make here is that philosophy and studying the discipline of philosophy will give us more tools to address those questions. And I'm not going to answer those questions for you. I want you to use everything we learn in today's lecture to be as a tool for you to think about these things and the various issues in your life and in your community. So, given all this, I hope even in a minute or so I've convinced you that we should learn more about philosophy and the history of philosophy as well, and how to think critically about a philosophical idea and how to create philosophical critique. And yes, of course, there is criteria for how to create a good philosophical critique, and there's good criteria for how to think about philosophical issues. Now, of course, there's not critique about which philosophical issues are more important. That's for you to decide. But there certainly is a mechanics to how the discipline works, and that's what we're going to unpack today. And once again, I'll say that STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, are not enough for a successful and prosperous society. And skills and even emotions and personal feelings are also not enough. None of those things ultimately give us deep meaning worth pursuing. And we partially rely on philosophy to do that. And to a certain extent, in some cases, religion and spirituality. Okay, so let's get started just answering the question basically, what is philosophy? Philosophy is not a science, but it's a discipline in the humanities. And if you don't know what that term is, other disciplines in the humanities would be art, music, theater, history, foreign language, etc., etc. And it's very important to make the distinction between the humanities and the STEM fields, which are science, technology, engineering, and math, which of course are just as valuable to society. And another thing to understand is that philosophy is not a religion, and philosophy doesn't have to imply religion or religious meaning. In fact, it's the other way around. Religions have philosophies, but the idea of philosophy is even more rudimental and fundamental than religion. Religions are built on philosophies as well as beliefs and social habits and behavior, and et cetera, et cetera. Philosophy is also not a political ideology like liberalism or conservatism, and it's also not an economic system. And again, I will say that philosophy is the smaller moving parts of all those things. So liberalism has certain philosophy. Conservatism has certain philosophy that's associated with it. Capitalism is an economic system, and it has philosophy associated with it. So these things have philosophy. Philosophy doesn't have them. Excuse me. Oxford Dictionary has 3 separate definitions of the word philosophy. And of course, Oxford Dictionary, one of the primary authorities on the English language. And let me read these 3 to you, word for word. The first one is philosophy as a discipline. And it reads, the study of the nature and meaning of the universe and of human life. Number 2 is a particular set or system of beliefs resulting from the search for knowledge about life and the universe. Number 3 is a set of beliefs or an attitude to life that guides somebody's behavior or an individual's behavior. And that's a particularly fascinating one, and we're going to unpack that particular question a little more later, and in some of the other lectures, namely the neurology lecture and the concentration lecture. Philosophy is an academic discipline, and also a philosopher is a profession, and it's a figure in society, especially with regards to public speaking and authoring. So in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the profession of a philosopher was very prominent, and there was a lot of social dignity associated with philosophers. And nowadays, we still see philosophers, and all you have to do is go to a bookstore and to see tons of people still use bookstores. There's a gigantic philosophy section, so people are still writing philosophy, and of course, there's a lot of philosophy podcasts and online resources. So it's also a role. A philosopher is a role in society. A tone of discussion is also something that philosophy is. You could have a conversation in a philosophical tone. You could have philosophical discourse. And that's to be contrasted with discussion of perhaps more pragmatics or practical discussions, or an urgent discussion to solve a problem or pressing issue. And of course, an interesting sociocultural fact is we see a lot of this in Mexico. A lot of discussions about solving problems, and sometimes infrequent discussions about things in principle or in concept, because it is a lower infrastructure environment. So therefore, we don't often have the luxury of thinking about things conceptually or in principle, because we're just solving one problem at a time. And that's one of the challenges of being in a third world environment or a low infrastructure environment. So philosophy can also be a tone of a discussion. And that also means that there's a larger, so we're going to talk about different time references and how that works in the brain in the neurology lecture or the neuroscience lecture. But when you have a philosophical discussion, you're also projecting into a longer time scale. So I might argue also that you have to be in a relaxed state in order to do that. So you're actually thinking about things from a very long-term conceptual point of view versus a short-term. So there's a different cognition in the passage of time, or in the concept of time, I should say, when you have a discussion that's in a philosophical tone. And like I said before, if you're a person that just kind of likes simple phrases to help you remember things, philosophy is the should. It is not the could. And of course, I have one of my favorite quotes that helps us know that is from Jurassic Park, 1993, where Jeff Goldblum's character says, you spent so much time thinking about if you could do the genetic engineering, you didn't stop for a moment to think about if you should. And that's a powerful line from that movie, and it's a great example. So hopefully that helps you remember what philosophy is and what the purpose of engaging in philosophy is. And of course, Jurassic Park is based on a novel, which is a cautionary tale. It's a sci-fi cautionary tale, and by Michael Crichton, that is a warning of the philosophical implications and the dangers of genetic engineering, for example. And again, I'm not going to talk about specific issues in this lecture. I'm just going to use examples. Okay, this next point is a tough one, which is, how is philosophy different than religion and spirituality? This is a tough one because they're so intertwined, and I would say nowadays many people are disinterested in religion but very interested in spirituality, which I think is interesting. And spirituality and philosophy, I think, work together very frequently. But terminologically, they are different. So both, let's say, philosophy and spirituality, they're both modalities that can include a belief or thought system that embraces the existence of a reality that cannot be physically perceived. Okay, and that particular point is from Britannica, another authority on the English language. So that's how those two terms are a little bit different. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about each subset of the discipline of philosophy. There's a couple different branches that serve as the foundation for studying philosophy. The first one, which has a lot of relevance to the present day, which we'll be talking about not only in this episode but other episodes, is epistemology. So you may have heard someone use this term, or you may have heard the term epistemic, not to be confused with epidemic. But epistemology is the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. So if you study epistemology, you study the nature, the origin, and the scope of knowledge. And you talk about things like knowledge justification and the rationality of belief. So it's kind of like a knowledge, about what exactly is knowledge and what constitutes knowledge. And, as it's relevant for the present day, what constitutes credible knowledge? And how can you create criteria that help you understand that knowledge has varying degrees of credibility, some of which can be specifically identified and others which are qualitative. Debates in epistemology are generally clustered around four core areas, the first two of which are most interesting. The philosophical analysis of the nature of knowledge and the conditions required for a belief to constitute knowledge, such as truth and justification. For example, testimony is a type of knowledge, or it's a type of activity involved the acquisition of knowledge. But of course, it's different than empirical knowledge, or it's different than phenomenological knowledge, we'll talk about in a minute. The second debate that's typical in epistemology is the potential sources of knowledge and justified belief, such as perception, reason, memory, scientific evidence, empirical evidence, quantitative evidence, qualitative evidence, and anecdotal evidence, or the example I used before is testimony. The next branch of philosophy is called ethics, and that's the study of what is right and wrong. And again, in an ethics class or a philosophy class, the teacher is not to teach you what is right or wrong. It's to use the tools to understand what is right and wrong. And we're not going to go into that level of detail here. I just want you to understand that ethics is in fact a branch of philosophy, and it's an academic discipline. And an ethics course might investigate some of the great thinkers in Western civilization and Eastern civilization, and how they defined right and wrong. The next branch is an interesting one, is axiology. And axiology is the academic study of values. So in an axiology class, you might investigate where do values come from, how are values defined, and how is there evidence of values in things like statements, interaction, public policy, artistic expression, etc., etc. It is the study of values. So an example, these are kind of abstract ideas. So for example, let me give you an example. Material possessions or material possession prowess is a value in the United States. And to create a diversity from that, culinary excellence is a huge value in Mexico. So these are axiological statements because we're talking about values. And if you wanted to make a good argument, you'd have to cite examples, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I'm just going to introduce you to the legs of the discipline today. So far we have epistemology, ethics, and axiology. The next one is aesthetics. And I've been talking with my dad about this one lately because he loves going down to, we have a cottage by the water, a very small cottage, about 10-minute walk from my house. And he's retired, he loves sitting on that chair looking out on the river. He says it just gives him this sense of beauty and clarity each day when he goes for a walk down there. And that's interesting, as aesthetics is the study of beauty and what constitutes beauty and what has constituted beauty for different civilizations, different groups, different ethnic or cultural groups, different religions, et cetera, et cetera. What exactly constitutes beauty, and is there a universal beauty? But again, science can't tell us that. It's something that is truly unique and mysterious. And I'm sure there's biological correlates to it. I'm sure someone did that research, but we're not going to talk about that today, nor do I know much about that. But aesthetics is the study of what is beautiful. And in fact, there's a lot of subjectivity to beauty. So for example, someone might make the argument that symmetry is beautiful. So that'd be an aesthetic statement. Or evaluating music. There's different aesthetics in different music organizations, different preferences for what constitutes beauty, et cetera, et cetera. So that one works with axiology, of course, because axiology is the study of values. The next leg of philosophy is called logic. And yes, logic is within the field of philosophy. There's also logic, you can study logic in mathematics, like computation and computability models, which you can study in mathematics, but logic's also something you can study in the branch of philosophy. And philosophical logic, which is similar to mathematical logic or computational logic, is doing things like clarifying the difference between inferences and implications, or evaluating past behaviors. And as a quick sample of that, an inference is drawing a conclusion based on what you already know, and an implication is making a prediction about a possible outcome of an action or decision. So these are rather technical sorts of issues that you learn about if you're studying logic in the branch of philosophy. A really interesting example of that in terms of a text was someone I had the privilege of taking a class with, Henry Pogorzelski, Polish professor, mathematics at University of Maine, had an interesting textbook called The Foundations of Semiological Theory of Numbers, The Foundations of Computability. We talked about modal logic as a collection of formal systems developed to represent statements about necessity and possibility. Super interesting stuff. So we won't go into detail with that, but that would be an example of a text written in philosophical logic, and probably to a certain extent mathematical logic. The next leg of philosophy is metaphysics. And that's a goofy, kind of new agey sounding word, but it has a real succinct meaning. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that studies the fundamental nature of reality, and the essence and the quality of reality, and how we might describe it. This includes the first principles being existence, identity, change, causality, space and time, cause and effect, and possibility. And now there's some people that are trying to combine these sorts of things with quantum mechanics and physical science and things, really, really hip stuff, very complex stuff. But that's what metaphysics is. Another term you might hear, which is sometimes interchangeable with metaphysics, is ontology. If metaphysics is about the essence of how the universe works, or how to describe the universe, ontology is more how to describe the nature of being and what being means. So in ontology, they talk a lot about consciousness and what is consciousness. And scientists can't explain that. And of course, in science, we call that the hard problem of consciousness, is that scientists don't have a remotely good way of explaining it. And when you study ontology and metaphysics, and also spiritual and religious traditions, we suddenly have a lot of language to understand and conceptualize these things. The next one is one of my favorites, especially as a performing artist and someone who teaches music, and someone who thinks of myself as a creative and emotional person, is phenomenology. And I've been finding myself use this term a lot lately because I can't find any other word to describe usually what I'm talking about. Phenomenology is an interesting one. It's an approach that concentrates on the study of first-hand experience, first-hand subjective personal experience. So some people might call that consciousness, and the investigation of phenomena as subjectively described by any one given individual, instead of creating formal categorization of concrete things in the outside world, which is a separate modality of thinking. Phenomenology focuses on how one might subjectively describe their experience, and then perhaps comparing that with other groups of people, or like in the social sciences, larger groups of people, and maybe finding correlations or commonalities. So that would be phenomenology, and it is not a science. It's absolutely not a science. A good example might be neurologists who study disorders of the brain and the nervous system sometimes rely on phenomenology outside of their field of neurology, because in the case of being a clinician, if you're a clinical neurologist, you sometimes rely on people subjectively describing their symptoms or their experience in order for the neurologist to effectively treat it. So a good example would be functional neurological disorders. There's very little that they can see in imaging or blood tests or taking pictures of the brain with things like MRI, MRA, CT. And so they rely on these phenomenological, subjective, qualitative descriptions of the first-hand experience in order for the neurologist to maybe understand what's going on. So that would be an example of why this is important at all, to know some of these terms. And we talk about phenomenology in the performing arts because we talk about the feeling one gets when they hear a piece of music, or when they, if you're a performer, if you're interpreting a piece of music, or what kind of experience the music gives you. And to investigate what that experience might be like for any one given person. So this, since I've even all far back as me getting my doctorate, I always found this super interesting, is phenomenology. Only now I understand these topics a little bit better, so I can speak about them concisely, as I want you to do. Okay, and the last category here is political philosophy. And that's intertwined with sociology and social sciences. Political philosophy, of course, looks at a lot of history, and especially things like leadership style and public policy style and various mechanics and architecture of leadership decisions and public policy-based decisions and economic models, and studies it from a standpoint of meaning and values. So that's what we call political philosophy. And of course, in that study, in that discipline, we use a lot of historical examples to understand. So there you go. That's the categories of philosophy, or the subsets of the discipline of philosophy. There's a few other important points I'd like to go over, again, without getting into too much detail, as this is just an introduction to the field. I want to describe the difference between qualitative and quantitative, because I think it has a lot of relevance to this lecture, and we will get more into that in the social sciences lecture. Quantitative is what most research is based on, and it just looks at numbers, or it looks at, in medicine, things like biometrics, things that you can firmly see, and then counting those things, and then presenting data points that are usually, without too much of a doubt, convincing. Qualitative is a little bit different, and this is what we use in a lot of social sciences research. It's used in a lot of psychology research, and it's used a lot in writing in the humanities, like, for example, in artist statements. There's a lot of qualitative writing. Qualitative is more firsthand, is more descriptive, and we do things like questionnaires, or written statements, reflections, descriptive writing, and these are types of things that are usually regarded as qualitative. It's about the quality of what you're writing about, not the quantity. So let's dive a little bit more into that. I want to highlight a discussion on what defines subjective, which is more personal, opinion, and implicit knowledge and information, and what defines objective, factual, concrete, explicit knowledge information. And I want to tell you that actually defining these terms becomes quite blurry, and it's difficult to put a finger on. And you may have heard the term narrative lately. You might hear people say, well, I don't believe that narrative, or that's just a conservative narrative, or that's a liberal narrative, or that's a narrative you hear on Fox News or on ABC News, or things like that. So people use this term, and I started to develop a particular interest in this term. What exactly does that mean? If you don't like a certain narrative, or you don't believe a certain narrative, it's kind of an unspecific term. So let's try to spell out exactly what it means. The term refers to a particularly important component of human thought and human experience, that which is storytelling. It's a very old tradition deeply embedded in almost any culture, in almost all cultures. We usually associate storytelling with, fairy tales, campfires, mythical monsters, or even a good movie script or fiction book. But these examples call the way across the spectrum to even the most scientific and academic lectures. Those even have a small element of storytelling. So even if you're presenting a very specific, well-measured data, there's still a component of subjectivity because you're sewing together a narrative by choosing which information to share, however credible, and when and what connections to make. So, of course, I'm not implying that all knowledge claims are in some way have a hidden agenda or manipulative or corrupt or this sort of conspiracy-like thinking. I'm simply illuminating that in order to fully understand any claim, we know that a philosophical position and a psychological orientation have to be considered. So there's no such thing as 100% objectivity. If you're presenting, and this gets pretty abstract on a metaphysical level, but if someone presents a paper with very credible, well-cited information, the fact that they chose to share that paper in that particular point in time already speaks to this inherent subjective nature of human activity and human behavior. So there's already an implicit value set being put on the table when someone chooses to share that paper. So what I'm saying is that there's always this component of storytelling there. And I'm just simply saying that to understand any claim, we have to know that there's a philosophical and a psychological orientation that have to be considered. And that goes on part of the presenter and the listener. There may also be strong forces at play that guide the presenter's philosophical and psychological position. And we need to make sure we investigate and understand those. And the argument of many people nowadays is that there's financial incentive. So it's very common for people to be very skeptical and very anxious about believing claims because they somehow theorize that there's a financial incentive for someone. So this would be an example of that. And a lot of people say the word bias lately, and that's a really important word to understand. So even the best professionals or the best teachers or the best doctors will have inherent biases about the way they share information and about which information they share. And I think it's a mark of a good doctor or a good teacher or a good professional to try as best you can to broaden your presentation or broaden your delivery so as to eliminate bias as much as possible in many cases. Because, of course, it can be dangerous when it's weighted too heavily, especially when the presenter allegedly stated intention is to be objective. If someone says they're being objective, that's a red alert for that there might be some bias or incentive there that's not objective. And that's a great reason why, if you're an educator, it's good to show diverse examples. So if you have a concept or a topic, it's good to try to show a lot of different examples of that given topic. And we talked about that in the education lecture. And I talk about that frequently when I'm telling teachers about effective teaching techniques. It also means that if you're doing a discipline like, if you're teaching something like political science or philosophy, which I'm not doing today, I'm just teaching you the mechanics of the discipline. It's good to show diverse examples, not simply your favorite examples. So that just goes back to being a good educator or doctor. A good doctor will share various treatment plans and describe why they're different and why they're effective instead of just offering up his favorite one. Okay, there's a few other points with regards to that objective and subjective conundrum. Anything scientific, scholarly, or medical should be as objective as possible, which is why a goal is usually clearly stated and sources are often cited. And a convincing narrative is crafted by creating a constellation of correlated claims and findings and reasoning within the narrative, rational reasoning, but of course will never be immune to these sorts of forces of storytelling. And you could make a fair neurological argument that it has to be a story to be understood, because the way that a human brain learns is not only explicit but implicit. It's not only declarative, but it's also non-declarative. And biologically, that means the limbic system and the rear brain areas, the older brain areas, are constantly interacting with the front of the brain and the more sophisticated brain areas. So storytelling is compelling for people, and it inevitably will always be a part of sharing knowledge. And this is another, and we're not going to talk about the AI kind of dilemma in this lecture series. That's for you to use these tools and think about on your own. But it does bring this to mind because when we speak about topics and issues, we are not computers. Computers don't have the ability to process non-declarative information beyond some really complex algorithms that people have tried to do, like at Cambridge and things. Computers can't think in ways that are non-declarative because a computer does not have a limbic system. It doesn't have a hippocampus and an amygdala and an entorhinal cortex and a hypothalamus. A human brain does. So we shouldn't be ashamed of this idea of storytelling either. We cannot remove ourselves from processing information implicitly with memory and emotion and sensory experience. So another word that's been used a lot nowadays in popular media and in writing and podcasting has been this word ideology or ideological. And again, I want to try to tease out what exactly does that mean. Again, Oxford Learner's Dictionary, one of the primary authorities in the English language, defines ideology as, and I quote, a system of ideas and ideals, especially one which forms the basis of economic or political theory and policy. End quote. And I might add to that, as well as religious. There's also religious ideology. And one important distinction to make is that if you're truly going to be an intellectual, you have to be careful of ideology in that it's intellectually limiting. And that's really the only point I want to make about this term, is that an ideology in the worst cases prevents people from using intellect and rationale and reasoning and unbiased argument to solve problems. And of course, in the present day, that's a no-no. So we need to use all of the intellectual resources available if we are going to indeed solve problems. So that's a little bit about what that term means. Another interesting question, which I would like for you to think about, is something that people get confused about often, and even people in the highest intellectual levels debate about, which is, how do science and philosophy relate to each other? Are they enemies? Do they complement each other? I don't, of course, have a clear answer to this, and I don't think anyone does. Science and philosophy is best defined, I would say, as just two different modalities of thought. And I think if we look back historically, we can safely make this assertion that they're both required for prosperous human living, and they're both required for prosperous human society. They're just simply different domains and disciplines and methods of inquiry. And there's some people that are trying to bridge science and philosophy, or science and spirituality, in some really interesting discussions. So some people that I would offer up that I think are thought leaders in these sort of areas would be Deepak Chopra or Sam Harris. Those are two people I think are really important figures that I'd suggest you look into if you're interested in the connections and the relevance between science and philosophy, or science and spirituality, and how these things can, from different disciplines, can actually interact and complement each other. But again, these are things for you to decide on your own. So, what are some important movements and historical examples of philosophies? Well, in the Western civilization, we should probably reference first ancient Greek philosophy and ancient Roman philosophy. And there's also ancient North African and Middle East philosophy. There's ancient Egyptian philosophy. But in terms of how it's relevant to present-day Western civilization, Europe and United States, and Latin America, ancient Greece and ancient Rome are the first ones I'm going to cite. With regards to the East, Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism are some of the strongest philosophical forces in that part of the world historically. Nihilism is an interesting one, and again, it's thrown around sort of pop terminology, sometimes magazines, YouTube, podcasting, discussions in academia, and that one maybe demands a little bit of explanation. Nihilism is a skepticism of the notion of meaning. Nihilists believe that that nothing inherently has any meaning, and nihilism has rightfully taken a lot of strong criticism. Eastern thought and Western thought is a very typical discussion in philosophy, because there's really fundamental differences between Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. I would say the simplest way to define it would be Eastern thought is fundamentally rooted in the idea of balance, and Western thought is relatively strongly rooted in the idea of dominance. So that shows a strong philosophical difference between those two large areas. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to do is talk about a few important authors and texts. Some very important ones in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and then moving forward from that would be Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. And then moving on from that, René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, Confucius, Bertrand Russell, and Niccolò Machiavelli. So just to name a few, those are some very important thinkers. And a text I might suggest you take a look into if you're new to philosophy is one of the most important texts in Western philosophy, which is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, the once king of Rome. And that's a pretty accessible short read, and is one of the cornerstones of applied philosophy for the West. Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki would be another suggestion I have for you if you're new to philosophy, again, because it's shorter and it's a relatively approachable read, and it can really help us understand a lot of Eastern philosophy, just kind of from the beginning, in simple terms. And then to understand European philosophy, or 17th and 18th century philosophy from Europe, I might suggest you try to listen to or read Friedrich Nietzsche. One person I didn't mention earlier was Carl Jung, although he's usually regarded as a psychologist. So those are some important names and a few just recommended readings. So what are some big questions that philosophy has addressed that ultimately will go beyond the scope of this lecture that I can just name real quickly? Philosophy has explored what is the meaning of life, what constitutes right and wrong, what constitutes beauty, freedom versus control, and the balance of freedom versus control. What is the definition of the word truth? What constitutes truth? Leadership styles and social political principles. What is the definition of a belief? And how can we understand what ramifications a belief has? So these are some of the principles that philosophy can address. Last thing I'd like to do before we do a little bit of a review is give you some tips on how to develop a philosophical critique. So I was speaking earlier about the difference between pragmatic discussion, or discussion that has a tone of pragmatics or problem solving for something that's urgent in more of a closer temporal proximity, versus philosophical or conceptual tone in the discussion. And one thing I want to give you are some bits of criteria for how you develop a philosophical critique. It's important to think philosophically about things and to challenge ideas from a philosophical standpoint. So the first thing I would say is simply reference your new knowledge of the aforementioned topics and question what kind of integrity a particular idea has. Try to trace the idea back to its earliest source. For example, if you hear an idea or a claim, can you see it from an axiological perspective? Meaning, what does the statement imply or suggest about its values? And should there even be an assumption there about values, shared values? If you hear an idea or a claim, see it from a logical perspective. Does it make sense when reviewed step by step comprehensively? Is it a non-starter in the sense that it doesn't add up? Or perhaps one thing has led to the other thing without any real reason. So try to see a full argument from a logical perspective. Next point I would have is, if you're trying to understand a claim or an idea from a philosophical perspective, can you use examples? Can you spell out an example for which that particular idea might be applied to? If you use real-world in context examples or hypothetical examples, it helps you think about the concepts, and it kind of takes away some of the abstraction of a concept. And the last thing I'll tell you about ideas for developing philosophical critique would be, is it consistent with history? So we have to know our history. With the particular idea in question that you're thinking about, is there a history of prosperity associated with the idea? Is there a history of suffering associated with the idea? Are there any important historical references or historic examples or correlations to that given idea or principle that may give it more merit or less merit? Those are all ways to develop a philosophical critique. And I guess the last thing I would say is be a good listener. And that's something that I would tell all my students, that I do tell my students almost every day, and I tell myself all the day, is that it's important to be a good listener. And in fact, thinking philosophically requires long cycles of thought. It requires discussion and discourse, and it's very important, and this will be a common theme throughout the entire lecture series, I promise you that it's easy to convince yourself that you're right. And it's very important to listen to another view. We're in a globalized time of diversity of thought and epistemological diversity. So it's very important to hear out someone's idea and also dial down the emotion that you might have for putting your foot down to be right, or to criticize someone else's idea, or to make assumptions, and instead try to dial down emotion and think reasonably with a two-way interaction, and that might take a long time. And sometimes when I'm talking with someone about something serious, or even just with other teachers about teaching techniques or whatever, sometimes I say, let me sleep on that, because sometimes it takes more than 24 hours for me to kind of consider someone's idea. So the last thing I would say about developing philosophical critique is you might be surprised at an idea coming to fruition after some patience, after some discussion, or maybe 24 hours, or even in a couple weeks or a couple months. And I'm sure my girlfriend's watching this lecture and laughing because I tell her frequently, you know, what you said about 2 years ago, I'm starting to think you're right. So never feel like too convinced that you have all the right answers when you're engaging about complex ideas in general. All right, great. So what I'd like to do now is a quick review of everything we talked about in this lecture and then give you some action items. All right, so we talked about a basic definition of what is philosophy. Hopefully kind of debunked some misunderstandings and confusion about what the discipline is. It's an academic discipline. And philosophy is the should, not necessarily the could. We talked about how philosophy is unconditionally and intrinsically a part of everyone's life. Every being that has free will or existential awareness, self-awareness, you're going to make philosophical assertions. So it's important to understand why philosophy is relevant to all of us, and knowing a little bit about the topic is relevant to all of us. We talked about how it's different than other things like the sciences and tech, and tried to define it a little bit more, what it is, what it isn't. We brought you through all the main categories of philosophy that you can study independently: epistemology, ethics, axiology, aesthetics, logic, metaphysics, phenomenology, and ontology. Not to be confused with autology, which is ear, nose, and throat study, but ontology, and political philosophy. We talked about the difference between qualitative and quantitative, especially in thinking and in research. Important to know those two terms. We talked about the conundrum of subjectivity versus objectivity. We talked about exactly what a narrative is. I believe this narrative. I don't believe that narrative. Talked about that really interesting term. I talked about the word ideology. We talked about how science and philosophy and spirituality are all kind of related to one another, but in fact are three separate terms. We talked about some important movements and historical examples of philosophy. Talked about some important philosophers and a few books of note. We talked about some of the questions that are typically explored in philosophy, such as the meaning of life, what's right and wrong, what constitutes beauty. And we ended with some tips on how to develop a philosophical critique, or insight into how you could think philosophically from time to time as an exercise, and to enrich your own life and the life of your loved ones and community. All right, so for action items, I have two things I'd like to discuss with you. The first thing is simply, I'm going to encourage you to simply try to think philosophically from time to time. How often are you thinking about immediate solutions to problems or being reactionary in a discussion or an interaction? And how often are you using it as a chance to think conceptually or in principle, or with regards to values or ethics? How often are you able to separate yourself from what you're doing at any given hour or day and think in those domains? Either think in those domains or interact with others in those domains. And I'd encourage you to give it a try. The second action item I have for you is to try to educate yourself in philosophy. This was not something we did today in the lecture. Today in the lecture, I just wanted to break down the discipline itself so you understood sort of where to start and why these things might potentially be important for you. But an action item would be to pick up one of these books. Try to read some Nietzsche or Jung or Socrates. It can be a challenging read if you've never done it before, but you'd be surprised how many versions there are out there of some of these great texts and great authors that are quite approachable and quite reader-friendly. So it does take study and time, just like anything else, just like studying for your engineering test, if you're a college student, or practicing a musical instrument. It does take time to really educate yourself in philosophy. So pick up one of these great books by maybe some of the authors or a different author that I didn't mention, and see if you can enter that headspace. And of course, a theme I always talk about in this series and in all my videos is repetition. Slow, patient repetition. And knowledge is power. There's no such thing as knowledge that's inherently bad or evil. All of knowledge is power. And of course, if you're really aversive to reading books, there's a lot of podcasts and audio materials in the philosophy domain as well. Okay, so the third action item, which kind of relates to the first one, would be when you engage in philosophical dialogue, or when you talk about principles, or think in principles, you want to be very respectful that other people might have different values and different ways of describing things like meaning and things like beauty. And if we are to live in a free society or a democracy, or a place that values freedom of expression or diversity or intellectual freedom, which is we talk about in academia a lot, intellectual freedom, you have to respect people's free will and freedom. So for example, if someone has a different philosophy than I do about something, or a different assertion of meaning or value or beauty, I don't have to agree with it to respect it. So I invite you to, as often as you can, whether it's non-verbally or verbally, show respect to other people if you come in contact with a disagreement or something that sounds unusual to you. Even if something is a bad argument or something you disagree with, you can still respect that person's free will. A really interesting, or the person's freedom to have that viewpoint themselves. A really interesting example in popular culture was a debate between two celebrities that you might have heard about. Matt Lauer and Tom Cruise once had a debate, I believe it was 2005, after his success with the movie War of the Worlds, in which there was a heated interview on live news about, and this is made public so I can share it without a problem, Brooke Shields' use of antidepressants after her first childbirth. And this was a sort of a public debate, and apparently Tom Cruise created a big criticism to her for using antidepressants, and he attacked the field of psychiatry as being pseudoscience, and he said that no one should be using psychiatric medication and these sorts of things. And I want to use this particular public debate, this famous public debate, as a good example to illustrate something. So in that case, Matt Lauer and Tom Cruise were in this discussion, and Tom Cruise was saying that he didn't approve of Brooke Shields' use of antidepressants because he had X type of opinions about psychiatry and its validity. So I want to make it clear that in that case, one can assert their opinion, assert their argument with all the rationale and all the evidence that they desire, but at the end of the day, it's crossing another line to say that someone cannot take action or cannot have beliefs that are different. That is an imposition of freedom, an imposition of free will, and it's just simply telling someone what to do. So that's not consistent with a free society, a society that values freedom of thought. So again, it's one thing to disagree and to provide an argument. It's another thing to say that she, and this is what Tom Cruise was saying, she shouldn't have the freedom to make her own choice about something that, of course, is perfectly legal. So that would be an imposition, and I think going beyond what I'm trying to define as appropriate philosophical discourse in the context of a free society. So those are some things for you to think about with regards to how to apply these things to your life. So those are my 3 action items for you with regards to philosophy. Again, the point here with this lecture series is that we're just going to scratch the surface of what all these important disciplines mean. So I hope you've learned something about the discipline of philosophy in this lecture. And of course, those who have PhDs in philosophy or teach philosophy that know the subject matter way better than I do, please feel free to provide any YouTube comments or clarifications on things or questions, or any of that is perfectly welcome. And of course, I do have well-cited references on the YouTube description and on the tributary description, just to make sure that you see where I got my information from when presenting this content. And of course, I'd like for you to keep watching this series. We're going to move on to episode 3 very shortly here. And of course, you can always follow me, scottyhorey.com, Scotty Horey on Tributary. And of course, body, mind, heart, spirit, and culture always work together. Thanks so much for your time, and please stay tuned for the next episode.